speaking. Thank you. We are live.
Good morning, dear colleagues. Welcome to this other scientific seminar of ERCIA. Well, if there are people who are not our colleagues, I'll introduce myself. I'm Angela Liberatore, the head of the scientific department of ERCIA. And we are very, very happy to have with us Professor Gilat Levy, who will tell us about an interesting topic, misspecified politics and the recurrence of populism. She will tell us about some scientific, particularly economic perspectives on an issue that surely we all discuss very often as citizens, as interested individuals, sometimes, of course, based on evidence and sometimes based on the news we receive and our opinions. So the take of Professor Levy on this is based on one of her ERC projects, which deals with populism and political polarization. And this is part of developing a dynamic model of political competition between two groups that differ in their subjective model of data generation process for a common outcome. One group has a simpler model than the other group as they ignore some of the relevant policy variables. As we know, most of us, in fact, all of us, even people in policy, always ignore at least some variables because perfect information only exists in theoretical models, isn't that, Gilat? So she will show us that policy cycle must arise in simple worldviews, which can be interpreted as populist worldviews, imply extreme policy choices, periods in which those with a more complex model govern increase the specification error of the simpler worldview, led to the latter to overestimate the positive impact of a few extreme policy actions. So I will say no more, aside from the fact that our speaker is Professor of Economics in the Department of Economics and Economic Theory Program Co-Director at STISERT at the London School of Economics, and she's a fellow of the Econometric Society and served also as a council member of the European Economic Association, and she specializes in microeconomic theory, political economy and law, political economy and law and economics. Without further ado, Gilat, the floor is yours, and then colleagues will be able to post their questions in the chat so that we will gather them for our question and answer session that will be moderated by our ever-efficient Daniele, who is the co-organizer of the seminar with Anne and Paolo. Thank you, Gilat, the word. Oh, and just to let everybody know, the seminar is being recorded and is live, so it's totally open access. Thanks to Gilat for that as well. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much. This is really a pleasure to be able to speak to ERC researchers and other researchers, mainly in other disciplines. This is not something that we're used to, so that's a really unique opportunity. So let me share my screen to show you the slides, so you can see the slides, I hope.
Yes, we can.
So the title, as Angela said, is Misspecified Politics and the Recurrence of Populism. This is joint work with Rani Razin and Alwin Young, who are both colleagues at LSE. And I'll take you through the main motivation that we started with, which later on amounted to a specific study of populism. We started with the particular idea that typically in economic and political science analysis of political conflicts, we think about different groups in society as differing in their original preferences. Different groups have different interests, of course, or they may differ in the information that they possess, which may lead them to different beliefs about, what should be the action that society should take. So together, these two usually form what sometimes political scientists call ideology, right? So you have different interests, or you have different beliefs. It's sometimes hard to distinguish between these two. What we do in this research is to try and focus on an additional difference that potentially exists, which potentially could be perhaps a better way to capture ideology. And this is the fact that different groups may have different models of the world, subjective ways to view the world. Okay, and this is something which is underexplored in at least the political economy study among economists and political scientists. Most theorists in the crowd and within political economy would agree that it is impossible to learn anything without having some theoretical model in mind. And it is often the case that fully rational actors would have persistent differences of opinions, right? We know this from macroeconomics. We know this in physics. There could be, big conflicts about what is the right model that we need to analyze. And in the political sphere, the fact that different groups or different individuals would have different models or different ways to view the world are going to be translated into different outcomes that would be generated to the rest of society when these different groups are in power, right? And the fact that whenever a different group is in power, they have a different way to view the world, and hence generate a different outcome, this is going to affect the future learning of everyone. Okay, so every group, potentially with a different model, can still learn from the outcomes generated by other groups. And that is going to be potentially create long-term differences that are never going to vanish away as long as these groups hold these different models. Okay, so that's our starting point to see this potential competition between different groups in societies when the only difference that they have is the fact that they view the world differently. If you want, it's some sort of a best case scenario for society, okay? A best case scenario in which we don't have different interests and we don't have different information, but we only have a different way to view the world. Okay, so we consider a political competition between groups that share the same interests, the same preferences over common outcomes. It's a sort of utopian world on that. They're going to observe the same information, but they're going to differ in their worldview. And we're going to focus on a specific types of worldviews. We're going to think about a complex worldview and versus a simple worldview. You can model worldviews in different ways. We're focusing on a particular type of interaction between something which is simple compared to something which is complex, and I'll provide more details on what we mean by that. And this is how we interpret populism. So we think about populism as a simple view of the world in the following sense. So many populist movements focus on a small set of variables as affecting policy. So some recent example, you build a wall, as the case with Trump in the US, you solve everything. You leave the EU via Brexit, that has been seen in the UK as a solution to many problems. And this fits, this idea of populism as a simple worldview fit with many other views or definition of populism. Populism has been quite elusive to define. And there are many types of theories of what is populism, motivated by the recent wave of populistic movement. If you think about one of the most dominant interpretation of current populist movement, the fact that it's the anti-elite movement that sort of identifies the will of the ordinary people, by necessity, it has to be the will of the ordinary people. By necessity is simple because you have to cater to some commonality, right? If you think about other features of populist movement that are anti-expert, anti-science, anti-rule of law, expertism and science, by definition, are quite complex. The rule of law is a complex entity, and authoritarian rules are typically quite a simple set of rules. So all of the other theoretical definition of populism will fit with this definition, that this is sort of something that can be viewed as a simple view of the world. So of course, it is not everything about populism to think about it as a simple view, but it is, I think, an essential feature of all theories of populism. Okay, it is not everything, but it is a feature of all theories of populism. In terms of actual policies, that is indeed another feature of populistic movement. One famous book by Dornbusch and Edwards describes populistic policies in a previous wave in Latin America, again, as focusing only on a small subset of short-run factors when they determine economic policies, so ignore long-term issues. Penal populism, for example, in the US, emphasizes the importance of tougher legislation on police funding, ignoring all other issues of employment, integration, and so on. Okay, so in actual policies, indeed, not only in the language that they use, but also in the actual policies that they foster, they focus on a simple set of variables. So the key question that we ask in this game theoretical model is whether political competition can potentially diminish simplistic worldviews. More generally, you can ask, will the correct worldview in the long term manage to diminish the incorrect one? Okay, so I will describe in more details the model itself, but just to give you a taste of the results, these are the key results. So the simple worldview is not diminished in the long term. In this model of political competition, we're going to have perpetual cycles of changes in power in which those with a simple worldview hold power for a set of periods, and at some point they give way to those with the complex worldview, but that does not last forever as well, and they have to give power to the simple worldview, and so on. Okay, so just to see one part of the cycle, the intuition is as follows: as the simple worldview is misspecified, it's not the correct worldview, that is an assumption that we start with, periods in which a more complex policy is implemented, when those with a simple worldview observe the outcome in society, they attribute the success of the outcome to the small set of variables that they think are relevant. That means that they think that the policy that they suggest are actually much more effective than really it is. So that means that they have an omitted variable bias. They attribute to their policies the key role in the success of the outcome. So for example, if they think that to combat law and order or crime, to fight crime, it's only police funding that matters, when they see a mixture of policies of police funding and other policies, when they see a successful outcome, they think it's only because of police funding. And as other groups do not implement a high level of police funding, they attribute the success of the policy to only police funding. That means that, so they increase the assessment of the effectiveness of a decisive narrow policy, and that increases their intensity and will to win the election and mobilizes their voters in a larger proportion. Okay, so the fact that they become they think that the policy is so effective is going to increase their will to win the election, and hence deliver the change in power. Okay, the second key result is that having a simple worldview implies that you also have an extreme worldview. Okay. In our model, that those with the complex model converge to have the true beliefs about the effectiveness of their parameters. The simple group converges to have wrong beliefs. That is not surprising because they have the wrong model, but the beliefs are going to be exaggerated, and hence they're going to implement wrong and extreme policies on all policy dimensions that they think are relevant. Okay. There is sometimes a link between simplicity and extremism. So you would think that in order to advocate an extreme policy, it's enough, for example, to use a simplistic language. Okay, here we show the other link. When you have a simple model, it implies that your beliefs are, at the end of the day, going to be extreme. Okay, and in particular, we show that the beliefs and the policies of the simple are collinear with those of the complex. Okay, so that I think is not a trivial result. That's quite an interesting result in the sense that they're extreme on all policy dimensions that they're advocating and in a specific way. Okay, in terms of contribution to the theoretical models that we have in economics, game theoretical models that we have in economics, there is a recent literature looking at convergence of beliefs with misspecified models. When we have the correct models, it is more straightforward to understand that potentially in the long term beliefs are going to converge. When you have misspecified model, it's quite more complicated, and our contribution to the literature is to show that it's possible that this can arise when you have more than one player, when you have a multidimensional state space, and when you have a set of continuous actions. Okay, so let me take you a little bit through the contribution to the literature before I give you the details of the model. So you wouldn't be surprised, there is a lot of literature on populism. One of the dominant papers by political scientists in Harvard, Engelhardt and Norris from 2016, pushes the view that populism is a cultural backlash and mainly rose because of issues of different cultural and social values. Okay, to me, I have to say that a lot of the cultural and social values that populistic movement are advocating, so against immigrants, some of them against women, these also relate to the potential of economic exploitation. So I think all these issues are quite correlated. Two main contributions that we have compared to the theoretical and empirical literature in economics and political scientists are that, first of all, we show that populism can arise as a recurring phenomenon. So our cycle results essentially establishes that. And second, we show that we give an explanation for why policies by populists are going to be suboptimal. This is because they wrongly interpret the outcomes that they observe that are implemented by other groups. Okay, so I would say differently, if if the population was completely homogeneous and everyone would have a simple model, it's true that the same simple model, it's true that they wouldn't implement the ideal policy, but because they don't consider all policy variables, but at least they would be able to interpret correctly how the policy that they implement affects the outcome. When there are many groups in society, their interpretation of their own policy variables is going to be quite biased because they're also learning from other groups. Okay, so as I said, within theory, we contribute to the literature on misspecified models. And we also contribute to a small literature on competition between misspecified models. One of the first papers on that was looking at different investors, how they assess their success in auctions. The key difference that we have compared to this literature is that what we have in our model is that the political actors interpret endogenous data that is not given to them exogenously, but data that they themselves over time create. Okay, so within our model, in each period, you implement a policy, you get an outcome, and that this particular outcome is going to create the history that you later on interpret. Okay, so everything evolves together, actions and beliefs. And that is the second contribution that we have to the literature. So let me go to specify the deals of the model. So we have two groups, one with a simple model and one with a complex model. Both groups have utility from a common outcome, which we denote by YT. T is the index of time in the model. Time is going to evolve discretely. At each period, we have the same data generating process. So Y, which could be seen as an outcome of growth, prosperity, any measures that you think is a good common outcome. Y is going to be a simple linear function. So xt is going to be the vector of policies implemented at period t, and beta star are the parameters that measure the effectiveness of particular policy X on the outcome Y. Epsilon T is going to be an IID noise normally distributed with mean 0. Okay. So super simple. Only two groups, they have the same utility from the outcome, and the outcome is just a linear specification. It can be more complicated, but we don't need to have a complex model. So what groups are going to differ on is the number of policies that they believe to be relevant. Okay, so I'll specify this in the next slide. I'm just giving you an overview of the model. The second element that I have to specify to you is the fact is how political competition determines who gets to implement their ideal policy. And what we do in our model is the group that has a higher intensity to win. So the group that it's more important for this group to win rather than lose, that is going to be the group that wins the election. Intensity is essentially what measures the ability to mobilize a group, okay? So, so that is going to be the political economy feature. Once you win the election, as the simple group, let's say you choose the policies that you like, okay? There's going to be some resource constraints, of course. And then everyone observes the outcome YT. So given the particular policies XT through the data generating process that includes this noise. So you observe the outcome YT, you learn via the prism of your model, okay? As econometricians do, as physicists do, you simply use your model to learn about the outcome, even though it could be another group that has implemented its ideal policy. Okay, learning is going to be consistent with Bayes' rule, but with OLS, so a simple estimation, ordinary least square estimation that the different groups are doing, and so on. Okay, so you learn, you update your beliefs via OLS and Bayes' rule, and we continue to the next period in which there is another political competition. The group that wins the election, implements its policy, we observe the outcome, we update beliefs, and so on. Okay, so that's the dynamic model. So let me specify the different models that groups have. So group C, with the complex model, has the correctly specified model. So we assume there are, in general, n different policies that could affect the outcome Y at every period. So I drop the index T here for a generic specification. Okay. And group S, the simple group, has a misspecified model in that they have a subset of the policies that group C perceives to be relevant. They only consider a subset, so X1 to XK. Okay, so that is our definition of simple versus complex. Okay, we can generalize this. For example, group C, the complex group, doesn't have to think about all the possible relevant policies, because essentially, if policy X n+1 is also relevant, but no one is implementing it in society because nobody thinks it's relevant, then it's not important for the process that we describe. Okay. In the paper, we also look at a more general model in which you can place weight on irrelevant policies. Okay, so that is also a way to extend the model. You can extend the model to think about groups that they have overlapping policies that they think are relevant. So everyone thinks that X1 is relevant, but one group thinks that X1 and X2 are relevant, and the other X1 and X3. So that's a model with overlapping rather than nesting political model. Some of the results are going to hold for this overlapping setting as well. Okay, so but let's focus. So let's start with this environment in which one group has a simple model in the sense that it's a subset of the relevant policies that the other groups considers, the complex group. And this model also allows for of course the simple group to be correct, in the sense that potentially beta k+1 to beta n could be very close to 0 in true life. So it is allowed in the model that the simple group is the correct one, but in general we think about the general set is such that it is potentially the case that those betas in blue are different from 0. Okay, so they have the model, but they don't know the values of beta. And this is the different betas, and this is what they're going to learn over time. Okay, so the true beta, remember, is some beta star, and this is what they're learning, and they start from, you know, the general set of feasible betas. Okay, so now a little bit of an economic model, a very simple model. Okay, so as I said, the utility from the outcome is just a linear utility. So you just want to maximize y, which is a linear function. So we embed a resource constraint. So the sum of the square x's, the policies that you invest in, has to be is bounded by some level r. Okay, so this is taken as an exogenous constraint. And that means that it is very simple to derive what is the optimal policy. So how do you divide the constrained resources that you have between the different policy variables, the different x's, okay? Given your some current mean beliefs beta, okay? So this is your objective function, right? So including the Lagrangian constraint. Okay, so you want to maximize y plus respecting the Lagrangian constraint. That gives you a simple solution that x is proportional to beta. So x1 is higher when beta 1 is higher, okay? The Lagrangian constraint lambda, the Lagrange multiplier lambda, notice it's a function of beta prime beta. The quadratic form is because of the quadratic resource constraint. We can extend this. It enables us not to think about, you know, beta positive or negative. You can have similarly, you know, x positive or negative when you try and maximize y. But beta prime beta essentially measure what you think is the effectiveness of your policies, okay? That is going to play a role, okay? So the more you think your policies are effective, the more you're going to be constrained, okay? So just bear this in mind for later. That's reasonable, right? When you think your policies are very effective, you want to invest more, you're going to be constrained by the resources. Okay, so putting those two together, essentially you invest in a particular, in x as a function of your mean beliefs beta. Only the mean is going to matter because of the linear outcome function. It's going to be proportional to the beta of that dimension, and again divided by, you know, the root of beta prime beta. Okay, so once you plug that into the outcome function, you see that given your beliefs, what you think you're going to produce as the outcome for society is again proportional to beta prime beta, the effectiveness of the policies that you foster given your current beliefs. Okay, so a group that thinks that its policies are more effective is also going to think that it's going to produce a higher outcome. Okay, so that is, bear this in mind. So I'm going to assume that the group with the higher intensity to win wins the election. What is an intensity to win? So think about group S. Its intensity to win is the outcome that it thinks that it will generate given its current beliefs and its ideal policy that we already derived in the previous slide, given its beliefs. The difference between that and what it thinks that group C will produce. So it knows that the platform of group C, it knows what group C offers, but it values what the platform that it offers through its own model, right? Through the beliefs of group S. Okay, so they compare what their politicians offer to them compared with what group C offers, and they value it using their beliefs, beta S. So the higher is this difference, the more they want to win. So if you think about a situation in which it's costly to vote, we model this in the paper. I won't go with this now. We microfound it in the paper. So if it's costly to vote, you're going to vote, the more likely you think it's important that your group wins rather than the other. Okay, so the group that is going to have the higher intensity to win is going to win the election. So the intensity of group S I've described, the intensity of group C is similar. So you value the output that you're going to produce, your group is going to produce vis-a-vis the output that the other group is producing, and again, valued by your own model. Okay, so here notice group S observes what group C is offering, and they see that they offer, for example, you know, not only police funding if they want to fight crime, they also offer some employment bonus, benefits, and they offer some integration, and they offer education, and they look at them, and they don't have to think that they have a different model. They can think that they are simply corrupt, or they think that they have different preferences, and so on. So you know, you can accommodate a world in which different groups have different models, offer different policies, but I don't necessarily learn from the fact that the other group offers different policies. Okay, one last element of the model is to understand this intensity and what it's going to create. Essentially, if you look at the output that you generate given your beliefs with your ideal policy, if you move a little bit away from it by delta, okay, you get this expression, the difference in the different outcomes is only minus delta prime beta, because both satisfy the resource constraint. we can get an expression, sorry, for the difference in output produced, that is again proportional to beta prime beta. Okay, so perhaps, you know, even if it's not too clear, the key result, very basic result that we have, the group that has a higher beta prime beta has a higher intensity of preferences. Okay, remember, this is the group that feels more constrained. And hence, when you move, because they're so constrained, they don't really get to implement what they really want. So movement away from this loom even larger, okay? Whereas if you don't feel that constraint and you move a little bit away from what you're going to implement, it doesn't loom very large, okay? So these are basic economic ideas of constraint maximization interpreted to this political model. So essentially the group that has, just bear in mind that the group that has a higher effectiveness, beliefs that imply higher effectiveness of policies, is the one that is going to have higher intensity of preferences and win the election. Okay, so to summarize, essentially the dynamic process goes in the following way. So even if you ignore the last 15 minutes, this is what you need to remember now. At period T, the winning candidate from group S or C implements her ideal policy. So the policy given her current belief from borrowed from period T minus 1. We observe Y. Both groups learn using OLS, given some initial data, so some prior. After we learn, we update our beliefs. So now we have the beliefs at period T. If the intensity of group S, beta prime beta of group S, is higher than that of C, S is the winning candidate at the next period, otherwise C is, and then the process continues. Okay, so everything that I said so far is summarized in these 3 bullet points with regard to the dynamic political process. So the question that you want to ask, you know, where is this process going to converge to? Okay, so we have a process in which we have social learning by different individuals with different models, just 2 models here. Okay, who takes an action and which action she takes is determined endogenously given the current beliefs of the different groups. The environment of models matters, okay? So again, if those with the simple model were alone in this world, they would potentially learn the value of the betas of their parameters. They wouldn't have wrong interpretations of other policies, okay? And as I said, it's a little bit complicated because the process is non-IID. Your actions today depends on your beliefs, which depends on the actions and the shock that happened yesterday. Okay, let me give you a simple example, okay, because we like simple models. Let's say that group S only considers one policy variable, X1, okay? So they only want to learn about beta 1, okay? Group C, let's say, just for the sake of the example, they know the true parameters beta star and assume for simplicity that there are only 2, at least they consider only 2 relevant parameters, X1 and X2. So X2 is truly relevant, let's say, and group C knows everything, okay? So we're just focusing on the dynamics of beliefs of group S. Why is it going to happen that we're always going to have cycles? Okay, let's think about a situation in which group S rules in the long term, okay? So they are always in power. In this case, they have the true model, right? They only think about X1, they only implement X1. So in that sense, their model truthfully captures what happens in society. That means that in the long term, they must learn beta 1 star, okay? So they implement their actions. In this case, is going to be the full resources. They're going to observe infinite observations of the outcome Y. They're going to be able to weed out the noise and to learn exactly beta 1 star. But group C knows that, in this example, they know the true parameters. They also know beta 1 star, but they also know that beta 2 star is relevant. So X2 is relevant. So they know that they actually allocate the resources better than S. So they're going to have higher intensity because they are able to produce a better outcome. And that is a contradiction because it cannot be that S is in power forever. Group C in this case will have a higher intensity and will replace them, okay? So we can't have group S in power in the long term. We also cannot have group C in power in the long term, which is perhaps the more negative or more interesting result, okay? If group C is always in power, the beliefs of group S, again, in the long term, they use a consistent way of updating the beliefs. Their beliefs are going to converge in the long term to explain the average output that they observe, okay? Group C is implementing a particular policy. They know the true parameters. So X1C and X2C are the ideal policies given their knowledge of the true parameters. The average output that they produce is this beta 1 star X1C plus beta 2 star X2C. In the long term, group S is going to have beliefs that could explain this, right? So how do they explain this? Their beliefs, beta 1S, has to be such that beta 1S times the investment of group C in X1 is going to equal this output, that the average output that group C is producing, okay? So they're able to explain what group C is doing with an inflated beta 1S, okay? So they're able to explain what the other group is doing, okay? However, if we go to the line at the bottom, given the beliefs that they converge to, this beta 1S, they feel they can produce a higher output if they move from X1C to X1S, right? Given their beliefs, they can do better with switching to investing all the resources in X1, right? So they think they can actually produce a higher output than what group C is producing. And remember, the level of the output exactly captures the intensity that each group has, okay? So they can explain what group C is doing, but they given their inflated belief, belief on dimension 1, they think they can do better, which means that their intensity is higher, okay? So it cannot be the case that group C is in power forever, because then the intensity of group C is going to be higher. A contradiction, they have to win the political competition. Let me show you the general argument in many dimensions. If one group is in power forever, because the two groups have some overlap in their policy dimensions, they can learn from one another. It means that in the long term, okay, let's say that group J is in power forever. This is what they produce, XJ prime beta star. Both groups are going to be able to explain the output on average, okay? Because you're going to have, you converge to a particular action, XJ, you're going to implement it in the long term. So in the long term, both group J and group I are going to have beliefs to explain this average. This comes from sort of rational updating of beliefs, even though you have a misspecified model. Okay, so group J is going to converge to some beliefs beta J, and group I is going to converge to some other beliefs beta I. This is because they have different models. They must converge to have different beliefs because they consider a different set of parameters. So group I converge to have different beliefs. But that means, and still can explain the average, but that means that given their beliefs, they know that they can actually implement a different action, xi, by necessity, because xi is the optimal action that they have given the belief beta I, it's going to generate a higher output according to their beliefs, and that captures their intensity. So whatever group is in power, because they have some overlap in the policy dimensions, and because they have different subjective models, they're going to, we're going to have and because beliefs have to, in the long term, in this case, to converge to explain the average, the result is that no group can be in power in the long term, okay? The intensity of the group, so the group in the opposition becomes more and more intense, and at some point it must replace the group that is in power. Okay, let me show you the dynamics of this in the one-dimensional model in which it's easy to see the dynamics, okay? Because we're going to have perpetual cycles in the long term in a dynamic model, essentially what the groups are going the beliefs are going to converge to a situation in which there is going to be equal intensity of beliefs, and that is what's going to generate cycles in the long term, okay? Otherwise, we can't have cycles if the beliefs are very different in the long term. So equal intensity, meaning they both think they can generate a similar level of output in the long term. So again, we're focusing here in this example only on the beliefs of group S. This is this one dimension beta 1, okay? And group C knows the true parameters. This is the point of equal intensity, okay? For beta 1, for group S, okay? Remember, when group S was the only one in power, it actually learned, in the long term, it actually learned beta 1 star. And when group C was in power in the long term, group S had an inflated beliefs beta 1 S, which amounts to this value, this particular value, okay? So the equal intensity beliefs is going to be somewhere in the middle. So how is the long-term dynamic process going to look like? If the beliefs of group S are going to be higher than the equal intensity, which can happen with some big shocks, okay? Their intensity is higher than the equal intensity, so they're in power, okay? Their intensity is higher than group C. When they're in power, they only implement X1, so the observation that they have points to the truth about beta 1, so their beliefs are going to decrease in time. At some point, the beliefs are going to go beyond the threshold of equal intensity, so that means that they're going to be below the intensity of group C. Group C regains power, but then they implement both X1 and X2, so the beliefs of group S start increasing because of the omitted variable bias. So in the long term, they're going to hover around this equal intensity, sometimes, you know, overestimating beta 1, sometimes underestimating beta 1, and power changes hand in the process, okay? So interestingly, they never learn the average of each regime separately, right? So they never understand exactly what they're doing and exactly what the other group is doing. They learn some mixture of the average. They can't learn too much about beta 1, okay? So just as an illustration with this two-dimensional model, we know from our result that we must have equal intensity. So beta prime beta, beta 1 S squared is going to equal beta star prime beta, okay? We also know that beta 1S has to satisfy the long-term OLS beliefs, okay, according to your estimator. And that gives us, and because we know already from equal intensity what the beliefs of group S has to be, that gives us exactly the long-run share of time that group S has to be in power, which is denoted here by gamma, okay? Just to get an idea about this, suppose that beta 2 star is really, really high compared to beta 1, okay? That means that to reach equal intensity, the beliefs of group S has to be really inflated, right? How do you get their beliefs to be really inflated? It is by group C being in power for a longer share of the time. That is how the equilibrium of the system can work, okay? So that means that if group S is very wrong about not thinking about X2, a positive result that we have normatively is that that means that actually group C has to be in power in equilibrium for a longer share of the time. The other side of the coin is that when group S is in power for a shorter part of the time, it will implement very wrong policies, okay? So that is how we equilibrate things here. If group S is very wrong, they're not going to be in power for too long, okay? However, when they're not too wrong, so beta 2 star is quite close to 0, both groups are going to share power equally in the long term, okay? So just a couple of words about the general the general model with many dimensions, okay? In the general model, we allow the group of C, C don't know the exact parameters, they also have to learn them. It is always the case that because they have always the true model, that they're going to understand the average output of each regime separately, okay? In the general model, again, shown you already the general argument, we're going to have cycles, and which means that we must have equal intensity. But in the general multidimensional result, we also get the result that simplicity implies extremism, and specifically that the beliefs of S and its policies are collinear with those of C on the dimensions they agree on. Okay, so I want to explain this result. In the one-dimensional model, it's obvious that the beliefs on X1 are going to be inflated, right? It must be that they're going to be more extreme because they wrongly interpret what group C is doing on X1 and X2. When you have a multidimensional model, it's not obvious that the beliefs of group S are going to be extreme on all the dimensions that they actually think are relevant. They have to be extreme on some dimensions, but we didn't think they're going to be extreme on all dimensions that they agree. Okay, so let me give you first the definition of what the result of what happens in the limit. Okay, when you take t to infinity. Specify this result and then give you the intuition for the extremism result and the collinearity result, okay? So in the limit, as I said, we must have equal intensity and we must have collinear beliefs. So the beliefs of group S on dimension I, which both groups consider to be relevant, are going to be A times beta I for group C. Sorry, I forgot the superscript C. So, and A is going to be greater than 1. So that's the collinearity beliefs, the collinearity of the beliefs of group S, and hence its policies with those of group C. Okay. And again, as part of the equilibrium, we're going to have OLS beliefs in the long term as a function of the long-term power sharing. Okay. Why do we have this collinearity? Again, OLS and any Bayesian updating of beliefs is going to imply that beliefs are going to minimize the weighted average of mistakes that you make across the two regimes. If you don't have collinearity, there is sufficient variation in the data in terms of the policies that are implemented, right? So there's going to be sufficient variation in the data. And so because of this sufficient variation, group S is going to know enough about the world to a degree. What they're going to be able to do is this sufficient variation. They're going to be able to understand correctly the average output of each regime, okay? So they're going to be able, for example, to understand correctly the average output that group C is producing with group C optimal policies according to the data generating process. The beliefs are going to converge to explain it, okay? But group C can also explain the average output that it produces, okay? So group C's beliefs are going to also converge to explain the average output that they produce because they have the correct model. But we already saw that when the two groups explain the average output of one of the groups, right? Because they have a different models, the group that is not in power is actually becoming more intense, right? Because they know what group C is doing. So their beliefs explain it, beta S, but in this case, they think they can actually switch to their optimal XS and produce a higher beliefs. So what does it mean? It means that we can't have too much variation in the data. Otherwise, we can't have an equilibrium, okay? Because we can't even sustain the cycles. So we can't even have an equilibrium. So we can't have too much variation. So the only equilibrating beliefs and policies are going to be those that generate hardly any variation in the long term, and that we can achieve with collinear policies, okay? So what we do in the main part of the technical appendix of the paper is to actually show that everything converges to this environment of collinear policies and the beliefs of equal intensity, okay? One technical slide. misidentification because we have multi-dimensions, and the fact that one group has a misspecified model, and because we have multi-dimensional policy space and continuous action, this is quite complicated to analyze convergence. What we do in the technical appendix is to add some little noise in policy implementation. You can think about it as bureaucratic noise, as some little experimentation that is not strategic. Okay, so some noise in the implementation of policies. That noise allows us to pin the fact that the long-term convergence must be to a unique equilibrium, because potentially there could be multiplicity of equilibria for C, and hence because of equal intensity, we know what the beliefs of S would be, but it's hard to show that actually beliefs converge when you have multiplicity of potential long-term equilibria. So with this little noise, for a small enough variation in the noise of implementation, the polity converges almost surely to unique equilibrium, in which we have cycles. The share of power of S is going to be smaller the more they are wrong. Okay, so this is A star is the parameter that measures essentially how much they are wrong. So the share of the true beta star prime beta star to the beta prime beta of only the policies that they focus on. Okay, so the share of time they're going to be in power is going to be a decreasing function in this A star. Group beta, the group C is going to converge to have the true beliefs, which we get because of this little noise, true beliefs on these parameters. And group S is going to have collinear and extreme beliefs. And this is A star is this collinearity parameter. Okay, so that is the key theorem. We prove a generalized law of large number theorems for non-IID convergence, and then we use in the limit a deterministic law of motion for the beliefs of S. I won't show you the graphs, we don't have time. This is in a two-dimensional model for group S. Essentially, you can show how beliefs must converge to the point of equal intensity and collinearity. These are the two conditions that specify model. Okay, so let me take 2 minutes, sorry, for a short discussion. We assumed myopic action in the sense that you don't think about the future process. So in a model, you implement the policies that you think are good for today, and you don't think about maybe I should implement other policies that are going to manipulate the beliefs of the other groups because they learn from my outcomes, okay? I think in the political environment, it's quite difficult to think about politicians implementing today policies to manipulate the beliefs of other groups in the future, because you do have to come to your voters and say, okay, I'm not doing the optimal thing now, but trust me, it's going to be okay in the long term. So it's not that obvious. But it is an interesting theoretical question to ask. Perhaps the complex group can take some strategic actions, not take what is ideal today, but take some strategic action to affect the beliefs of S in the long term. The key results that you can actually identify is that it's not possible to do without a substantial cost, okay? If the long-term action of C is the correct one, and that's the one that you're going to take in the long term, if you're going to take in the long term the correct action, which is what you want to do as group C, the long-term beliefs of S must be as we describe them. So if you want to affect the long-term beliefs of S, it must be that your steady state long-term action is constantly biased from the optimal action. So that means that affecting the beliefs of S will come at a substantial cost. So it's not as easy to get away from this problem of those with a simple model, having wrong beliefs and implementing wrong actions in the long term and staying in power for a substantial share of time, okay? I think one interesting question that this model raises, in this model, and again, in many ways that I think about scientists also, we may have a misspecified model for a really long time, okay? So group S in this model never looks at other policies. They think it's not relevant, so they don't look at them, they don't check whether their model perhaps is wrong, okay? That could be seen as a weakness of our model, but that could be the situation in many environments, at least for many years, okay? It's quite difficult, I think, for individuals to change their models. There are a lot of literature that looks at how, you know, your ideologies are set up in your formative years, and it's very difficult to get away from your worldview. But it's not obvious how, you know, how voters are getting these models. Maybe in the formative years, maybe some politicians have a reason to come up with a simple model and convince them that this is the right model. So what comes up from our model is that if only the complex model was there, let's say the correct model was the only one prevalent in society, a politician that wants to be elected has an incentive to come up with a simpler model, right? Because she will gain in popularity, right? Because the group, if a group will adopt it, they will become intense in their preferences, as we've shown, and then this politician is going to be elected, okay? Potentially an ideological politician that wants to implement a particular policy will also use a model as a device to convince voters to support her as a justification. I think this is an interesting question to ask, you know, when do you abandon a model and switch to a new one? Again, this can apply to other environments, okay? So let me summarize. We have analyzed the model of a competition between a correctly specified and a misspecified model in politics, combine it with a political competition model that relies on intensity of preferences. We consider populism as a simple worldview, and we show that political cycle must arise. Populist and extreme policies must prevail against the correct policies, and the policies of populists are collinear with others, so more extreme on all the other dimensions. Okay, we show this convergence of beliefs and actions in the multidimensional policy space in the model with continuous actions and two players. Okay, so I finished and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Gilat. And you will not be surprised to hear that there are already a number of questions. So Daniele will oh yes, I should start my video. I get, voila, sorry, you could only hear the voice of big sister. So you will not be surprised to hear that there are already a number of questions that Daniele will raise in moderating the question and answer. So I'll just take the chair prerogative to start with a question, because actually not long ago we had a very different internal seminar on the notion of learning. In that case, it was learning from Chernobyl, unfortunately quite timely for the bad reasons, as we all know. And you were mentioning at the beginning, actually, of your presentation, and you developed it further, that you only learn if you have a model, and then you explained to us the models. And of course, you were focusing on competition, also of those models, or misspecified models, as you call them, in relation to elections. So, of course, what we understand is that you're focusing on groups. And in focusing on groups, I think you mentioned, but maybe you can tell us a little bit more. I mean, how much you have been considering in your work, learning from those models, cognitive aspects, okay, apart from the obvious group think and the others that you have been directly or indirectly addressing. The organizational aspects, I think you mentioned, for example, people who look at other policies or other information. It means they are probably in an organizational setting where it is good to look elsewhere. There are organizational settings, we even call certain organizations learning organizations. We think at ERC we are one, but you know, other organizations are based on other principles. Keep it closed, don't look around. And then, of course, there are institutions. I mean, we have law and we have constitutions, for example, through which people learn in their formative times, as you were mentioning, for example, that killing is bad. In fact, they learn it because the law says you must not kill. And, you know, most constitutions say not even the state should kill. Well, others say that the state can. So what is, if you like, those elements, cognitive, organizational, institutional, that you consider in your analysis? I know it's not an easy question, but...
No, I mean, so in line with the model itself about simple environment. So to a degree, I have to simplify the model. So the environment is quite thin on institutional features. But I think we can still discuss it in the setup of the model. So in terms of cognitive issues, so the big cognitive assumption is that different groups have different models, and the big cognitive assumption is that you stick with your model here. Okay, it's as if this model, somehow, I don't know how, you have this model in mind and you never suspect that your model is wrong. So that is a big cognitive assumption, which one justification is that when you think some information is costly, right? So if you think that some policy variables are not relevant, you're not going to spend time and resources looking at these particular policy variables, right? You're only going to look at the mapping between the policy variable that you think is relevant and the outcome. Okay, so that is the justification for this particular cognitive issue. You stick with your model, you never change it. Other groups offer other policies. You can justify it to yourself by thinking that they have other preferences. Maybe they're corrupt, this is why all these liberals invest in these integration centers, I don't know, they benefit their friends and interest groups. That is some of the rhetoric that is sometimes being used. You can, of course, enrich the model with other cognitive problems, right? To a degree, we didn't want to stack the cards against those with the wrong model. We gave, to a degree, the best case scenario for society to say, look, of course, these people are going to have different ideologies, right? In the sense of what's the right thing to do. So it's the best case scenario. So I have some other working on, information processing, neglect of correlation across information sources, that you're actually completely unable to understand the information that you observe, or to a degree. Here, this is the best case scenario that they're like two econometricians or two scientists looking at data. They just have the wrong models. Okay, one of them at least. So one of them at least has the wrong model, and so I think that is valuable to do, looking at the best case scenario, to see that even in this case, we're not going to be able to diminish those with the wrong model. Of course, all learning is filtered. So here it's filtered only through history, in the sense that we create the history and we observe our own history. You could, and learning is perfect in the sense that you can observe the full history. Okay, again, the best case scenario. You can think about individuals having only short-term history, and that is going to bias the way they learn, and then the beliefs are never going to converge, okay? So that is also a valuable type of research to do, but we didn't add this. So you can observe the full history. In terms of institutions, again, we allow individuals to observe everything. So some institutions are going to not allow you to observe some of the relationship between policy, right? So strategic politicians are also going to tell you things like, don't look at the recent history, look at the 50s. And in particular, they will interpret the history for you, right? They will say, this is the mapping. When we use this policy, we had great outcomes, and some voters are not able to check it. So the history is filtered by many organizations. Again, here is a best case scenario. Yeah. So the only problem here is that people have different models. Everything else is perfect. Okay.
And as we know, in real life, there is no perfection. So
of course, but that is the issue. Yeah, that is the issue. To a degree, even in this best case scenario, you're not going to be able to get rid of a wrong model.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Gilat. Over to you, Daniele, for the moderation of the question and answers.
Thank you, Angela. So I will also start with a couple of questions from my own. One is general, and because with my friends, physicists, we've been discussing a lot about these things. And the general question is, what do you think is better in case you want to avoid the simple group to take over and to have too much power? Do you think it's better to simply ignore what they do in the social media, or to share and trying to disseminate what is the more complex view? Because some of my friends say, if you see something, some populism on Twitter, for instance, you simply have to ignore it. And some others say, if you do see this, you have to reply, to share, and see and say why what they're saying is wrong. And this is the first question. Then I have two other on the model and more technical.
Yeah.
And in the model, as far as understood, the alternate is based on the fact that these two groups share at least some policies. Yes. And the fact that they win election in different times is because the simpler one thinks that the other one is not doing enough on the variables that they don't see, basically. And the other thing that the complex things that the simpler one is doing only a lot on something that is narrower. Yeah. And then the question is, what if they don't have any overlap? How this interacts, because this is the key point of alternance. Yeah. And the other question, technical, is you have mentioned two groups, but what if there are more? How do they interact? It would be more complex, I suppose. Yeah. But what if they become to a continuum instead of only a discrete number of groups?
Okay, so I'll go backwards. So a continuum is it's hard to think about a continuum of policy variables in a political setup, but in general, many groups is just in most of political economy model, it's just much harder to analyze political competition with many groups. So between two groups, it's always easy to find which group is winning. We have models of that, of course. You can think about the groups that have the highest intensity. Some of them may have more, it may be more than two groups, and then they can share power and so on. So you can potentially analyze this. I would think that probably it would be harder to analyze analytically, but we could probably simulate such a case, but we haven't done that. For the case of overlapping, so as you said, it's important. The whole mechanism is about learning also from outcomes of other groups, which creates the wrong interpretation for the simple group, and also potentially benefit the complex group because, of course, in the long term, they would learn the truth, but in the short term, they get some experimentation. They can differentiate the effect of X1 compared to when they implement many other policies together, and sometimes, at least without noise, it's hard to understand the different effect of different dimensions. If you don't have an overlap, you don't need to observe what the other group is doing, okay? In that case, I think our model is less interesting because if you don't have an overlap at all, because it could be that according to your prior beliefs, you don't think that your parameters matter much. And then the other group takes power and can stay in power in the long term. So, but that is only because of some history-dependent outcome according to your prior beliefs. If we do have a overlap and non-nesting, the cycle result is also there, right? Because it only builds on the fact that both groups can learn from each other. We could not technically prove convergence of beliefs for this case. We may be able to prove it in the long term, but that is why which is why we couldn't also show collinearity and things like that. So, but if you want, the key thing about cycles also stays in the overlapping model. We don't need the nesting model for that. In terms of what to do with what we observe in social media, viewed from the thin lens of this particular model, to a degree, it seems to be better that there is some interaction between the two groups. I would say, view from this thin lens, it's actually not obvious, because I have to understand what will happen when they how often they would win power. Okay. But if they don't learn, it's almost as if we don't have overlapping policies. So to a degree, maybe this particular interpretation relates to the fact that the groups don't learn from each other. It's like having non-overlapping dimensions, and then anything can happen. Okay, depending on a particular history dependent context.
Okay, thank you. So we have a question from the audience as well. And one is about who decides what is the correct view of the world. And also the analysis is based on the fact that there is a correct view. So why there should be a correct view, and who decide which one is it?
So so again, the best case scenario is that there is something which is good in general for society, okay? And that so everyone agrees that to increase the outcome Y in the model is a good thing. So everyone agrees on that. That is the best case scenario. And then we would think that in reality there is a true data generating process, that if we would know this process, then we would all agree on what is the outcome. So our model is general in the sense that it could be that the complex group, could be wrong in some sense, but if the true parameter, let's say in the simple example, beta 2 star is close to 0, then the simple group is true as well. Okay, so it's not, it is potentially, we account for the fact that the simple group can have the correct model, and then they would share power half of the time. And we can also give the complex group some beliefs in wrong policy variables, and then in the long term they would learn it given the little noise that we add. Again, if groups have different preferences in society, conflict is going to be much stronger, because there is no, we don't even agree on what is the common outcome that we want to achieve. Okay. So, of course, in reality, all of these types of conflicts are there. But a lot of, research that we have already looks at different interests. So we wanted to look at, common interest to shut down this avenue, and to look at different subjective models, which, may also apply to a group of scientists. You can think about, evolution of models in this way. We all learn from the experiments of one another and the results of one another, but we can potentially interpret these results differently. So, of course, if you add other conflicts, it's going to be more difficult to reach compromise in society.
Okay. So another question from a colleague that did not write in the chat, but it wrote to me. So basically it's asking if you have considered the influence of the voting system, meaning that, for instance, you have referred to grouping power, but suppose you are in a proportional voting system, there might be more groups that are in power, even without sharing massively their beliefs. And this means that they have to get into a kind of compromise when they are in power. So what is the effect of this kind of different systems?
Yeah, we haven't analyzed this. I think this is really important and interesting. How are coalitions created? Sometimes coalitions are created between those that are very different, because of different on more than one dimension, because they may find it actually easier to reach a compromise when they have a multidimensional difference between them. And when you just have one dimension of conflict, then it's harder to find a compromise that everyone is happy with. So because there is no give or take, both of us have to give rather than give on something and take on something else. So that could be potentially a way to go, to think about potentially groups that may differ very much in their subjective worldview will find it easier to reach a compromise. But that is very important. So we don't have this in the model.
So another question I have is, consider we stay with two groups.
Yeah.
But and everything works perfectly if they're distinct. But what if there is a kind of migration between people who are belonging to one group or the others? So how this is affecting the world dynamic?
Right. This is nice. So you could potentially think about, the more a particular group is in power, the more people switch to this group. That's one potential dynamics that we can add. Or the more successful is the group in the sense that they produce a higher outcome. That could be another dynamic element, like some evolutionary type of dynamics. I think it is something that we can definitely introduce in the model. But then I think the way you model it, if the more you're in power, the more people are joining you, that is going to go against the cycle results, right? It's going to sort of consolidate power. But maybe the interesting dynamic is that the higher outcome you produce. So for example, we have the shocks epsilon in the model, okay? And then there could be some periods in which there is a series of good shocks, and you implement a higher output, not because your model is correct, but just because of these shocks. And then it could be that could be an interesting dynamics that is not necessarily is going to allow for consolidation of power. So that could be a nice feature to add. Yeah.
Okay, so I have another question about Italy, because it was a really great case. I don't know if you know it, but there is a party called Movimento 5 Stelle, so the 5 stars, that are they're really uncommon way, because it started in the web and it went up to being the first party in Italy without having ever been in power. So they were not in the government for a while. They've been now in the recent years, but beforehand, there has been a massive increase in their popularity. And is this linked to the fact that they haven't been in power? So being in power is somehow intrinsically decreasing their popularity, right?
So right, because you're more generally, you're much more judged by your voters when you're in power compared to when you're not in power. So right, especially when you have the wrong model, you're much more likely not to be faced with outcomes generated by your model, right? So you can always say, the other party, they do this and it's wrong. Or you could say they're successful, but actually because they're using our policy, and we should actually invest more in this particular policy, right? So according to my model, the group in opposition is gaining more and more intensity and easier to mobilize. But I think even more generally, when you have a wrong model, you're much more, you can't be prone to criticism when you're not in power. And once you're in power, and I think actually maybe with the 5 stars, they moderated a bit, no? So I think it does fit this idea that once you're in power and you implement your policies, now you're thinking, okay, it's not as successful as I thought. I can actually moderate my action. And of course, you're much more prone to criticism, and you're becoming less successful to a degree. And also in power, more generally, you have to deal with some issues that you never thought about, right? I mean, you never were not part of your manifesto or your even worldview to a degree. So that is another problem, typically for single issue parties, that suddenly they have to deal with many issues. But I think the 5 star is a relatively good example of a populist movement that once in power moderated a little bit, yeah.
But then the other question is, why is it that common that there is a group coming out of anything from scratch and then they become popular? Because the 5 star movement has been considered in Europe as a kind of exception. So why is this not happening more commonly?
Well, there are 2 obstacles to be in power. One is the voting system, right? In the UK, it's super difficult to enter as a new party because of the voting system. In Italy, it's easier. In some countries, it's even easier, like in Israel. The other is the organization of a party more generally. It used to be very difficult, running in local election and all this type of stuff. It's potentially coordinating a movement and creating a new party with the organization, everything is nowadays potentially easier with social media and digital resources and everything else that you can organize. But you need to create a reputation, a brand name, and so on. I think nowadays, younger people know how to do it very well, and it's probably much easier to do. So both these types of obstacle. The big parties have this big machinery of mobilization and so on that has been, tried and tested. And now if you do mobilization online, you don't need the big machinery that you had before.
So what you're saying is that it's likely to become more popular, more easy.
When voting systems allow for that, right? Yes. Yeah. It's also, so political scientists think that that is one of the key reasons that we see a lot of party fragmentation in Europe, is that it's easier to create new parties, and the younger generations don't have the traditional voting patterns to the old traditional parties. They are open to voting for new parties because they don't have the baggage of the old times. So and to a degree, fragmentation is considered a problem in nowadays, because it's harder to form coalitions before the elections, after the elections, and so on. But one of the reasons for this fragmentation is younger people have preferences for new parties on many types of issues because they don't have this baggage and tradition. But it's also easier to create these new parties. Yes.
Okay, I have another question from the colleague who's writing to me. So he say, if you can comment on the specificities of the UK and US system that are really strongly polarized in terms of having two groups dynamics, which maybe is the one that is more, it's closer to your model. So what are the specificities in this sense?
So the two group dynamics is strong in the UK and the US because the voting system really doesn't allow you, to, even if the voting is according to constituencies and it's regional, and even if you succeed in one particular small region, you're not going to have as a new party a majority. So your best hope is perhaps to create a coalition with another party. But so it is a big deterrent for other parties, although they could influence in terms of policies. So, for example, UKIP was a big threat to the Conservatives, and that is one of the reasons why Brexit was pushed by the Conservative at the end, because they were worried about a small party taking. So I think they do have an effect, but from outside the system, not from within the system, so much. It's not that we wrote this model with the view of analyzing UK or US politics. We just wanted a simple model to get some insights and some intuition. As we said before, I think it would be interesting to extend this to think about how coalitions are created in a more parliamentary systems.
But somehow, have you tested them with some empirical evidence? And if so, what is the different outcome depending on the countries?
Yeah, no, we haven't tested it yet. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. And do you plan to do it?
Our results about long term, we're not going to be able to prove these results, but we could try and test some of the mechanisms in terms of greater intensity that increases over time when you're not in power, and to try and elicit some of the beliefs of the different groups and to see how they interpret, actions of other policies. There are some empirical studies already, for example, looking at law and order policies, and because I think crime is a good example of individuals that focus on some particular dimensions and not others. And so, there's some evidence for some cyclical patterns in these types of policies, but it's not tailored to our model, so we have to do a more refined work on that. But that would be something that would be really nice to do. Yeah. I think we have to team up with some people that are more empirical.
It's the same old story. The between theory and experiment.
Yeah, absolutely.
In all fields.
Yeah, it is potentially something that might be easier to test in lab experiments, which a lot of economists are doing, and trying to understand how beliefs evolve when you observe outcomes.
Yep.
Yes.
I can give it to you back, Angela.
Yeah, I see no other questions indeed, and it was a very lively discussion and a very important both topic and areas for research. This is also, of course, an area where it is so important to try to understand things analytically, because it's obviously in itself a very heavily normative field. And when you have a norm against another norm, there is very little learning or a sharing of experience or whatever that can happen. So the question is how we can analyze norms and norms foundations, and how they're shared or otherwise, and trying to help ourselves with the best analysis we have, knowing, of course, that all the analyses have their limitations for the reasons you explained, certain assumptions, certain information, and so on and so forth. But I think it is really part of never giving up on the fact that on whatever we analyze, we really need to have that kind of discipline and keep on going. And I think that for our colleagues in physical sciences and in life sciences, it's always very good to see that sometimes they might read in a newspaper something that they might find obvious, but actually most of the time, before it becomes obvious, is the laborious work of a lot of people in social sciences and humanities to reach the point of saying, is migration bad for the economy? Well, overall, no. But before you can say that seems very simplistic. You have to go through, gosh, damn hell of analysis, data, and so on and so forth. So I think this seminar illuminates one of those aspects. So Gilat, thank you very much for that, for engaging with us in presenting your and your colleagues' work in such an important and not easy at all issue to address. And thanks to, again, Danielle and colleagues for the organization. And we conclude on perfect timing, even 3 minutes in advance. That's very economical. Thank you, Dan. Goodbye.
Thank you for inviting me.